Another aspect of image making to think about is cropping. What this means is how close up to or how far away you are from your image. And this determines exactly what you're going to see of the image. So here, for instance, we can see a close-up of the apple, but we can still determine that it's an apple. There's still enough visual information there to let us know what it is. So sometimes it's useful to think about what is the closest that I can get to my object and still represent it in a recognizable way, versus what's the furthest away that I could get from my object and still have it be recognizable. And this notion of recognizability can be really pushed in image making, particularly in an exercise like this where you're making a lot of different versions of images of the same object. So for instance, this image might only really look like an apple in the context of you seeing it in a group of images with a bunch of other apples. On its own, you might have a hard time recognizing what it is. But that's okay in this instance, because part of what we're trying to do here is get you to experiment with different techniques, and they're not always going to work. So try things that you don't know how to use. Try things you haven't done before. Maybe for some people that might mean looking at technology and trying to use new programs that they may be uncomfortable with. For other people it might be getting more hands-on skills and working off the computer. But try whatever you can and just really experiment and just see what happens. Part of what I think is valuable about this kind of visual experimentation is that you really push the boundaries of denotation and understand where they lie. You're really testing, when is this image going to break down and stop being readable as the object that it was intended to be readable as? When does this apple stop being an apple? Another aspect of image making that you can think about is texture. We quite often think about things being very flat in a digital world and having a pixel texture. But if you're making images by hand and with objects and paint and raw materials onto different surfaces, quite often that texture can be much, much more important. So sometimes even the simplest element, the simplest representation of that object with a little texture can be really interesting. And one of the things that can accentuate the texture of an object or of an illustration can be a contrast. So here we can see there's two different ways of making this image. There's the soft crayon line, but then mixed with this very rough and textured collage element. So the contrast is actually what's giving the texture or making the texture be visible. So often it can be really interesting to take different processes and different kinds of materials and image making techniques and mix them up, mix them together. So maybe take something you're very familiar with and something you're less familiar with and see what happens when you pair the two. And one of the best things about this is quite often the images that you make can end up being quite surprising. And again, surprising to the viewer, but also surprising to you as an image maker. And that means they get to be fun to make. And quite often, the more that you can mix these different ways of working and the more unexpected the work becomes and the image making becomes, then the more original the image becomes. And you start to make things that not only surprise yourself, but they're images that you probably haven't seen before, or you haven't seen them made in this exact way. And that's really great. It starts to get at an originality and starts to get at you developing your own personal style and your own way of image making. And trying to get at this idea of originality or an original way of image making can quite often mean that you have to do some things that might surprise yourself or seem a little silly. So here, for example, some of these images are made by not taking the pen off the piece of paper or by deliberately drawing in a naive way. Or here, for instance, these drawings are made blind, so the designer, the illustrator, isn't even looking at the piece of paper while they're drawing. And again, here the image is made by just one continuous line without taking the pen off, but it's in a totally different style. It feels much more like a contour map as a way of drawing the apple. Be inventive and try and think of strange ways to make images. And that can sometimes be taking a low-tech or guerrilla approach to image making. So this image, for instance, is made just by putting the apple core straight on the scanner and scanning the image without really knowing what it's going to come out like. Or here's the same idea with a different low-tech device. Here the apples cut in half are just placed on the glass surface of a photocopier. And again, what's great about this is you can get very surprising images very, very quickly.